As you might have heard, on Wednesday afternoon, the US Senate voted to acquit President Donald Trump on both articles of impeachment. As such, he'll remain in office and continue to fight in the 2020 presidential election, although some Democrats have already mentioned a second attempt at impeachment. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the conclusion of the impeachment trial, some of the past attempts at impeachment, and what it means not only for Trump's re-election, but also for the congressional Democrats heading into the 2020 election. If you'd like to know what happened earlier in the impeachment process, then check out our videos on that. There's a link in the description. Before we get going, a quick shout out to our Patreon page. If you want us to produce more US content, then throw us a few bucks and get a bunch of perks in return. And if we hit our milestone, we'll guarantee at least 2 videos a week on this channel. Before we get into what this means for the election, let's take a look at what happened in the Senate. On Friday of last week, the Senate voted 51 to 49 not to call new witnesses to appear in the trial, with only 2 Republican senators, Mitt Romney of Utah and Susan Collins of Maine, voting in favor of the motion. This was a particular point of contention, as Democrats maintained that certain witnesses could provide evidence of Trump's wrongdoing, primarily former National Security Advisor John Bolton and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. As we mentioned in our last video on impeachment, if the Senate had consented to more witnesses, the trial would have continued, likely for several more weeks. As it stands, however, with no new witnesses, Senate took to its closing arguments on Monday. Then, throughout Tuesday and Wednesday, senators were given 10 minutes to speak and explain their vote on conviction. All eyes were on a group of Democratic senators who were speculated to break from their party and vote for acquittal. These included Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, and Doug Jones of Alabama. In some cases, senators, including Manchin, called for a censure vote instead, or a formal statement of disapproval. They argued that this would be a much better way to show unity in a country deeply divided. In the end, however, all 3 voted to convict. The only real surprise, the only person who broke away from party lines, was Mitt Romney of Utah, who voted to convict on Article 1 but not Article 2.
As a senator juror, I swore an oath before God to exercise impartial justice. I knew from the outset that being tasked with judging the president, the leader of my own party, would be the most difficult decision I have ever faced. I was not wrong. The grave question the Constitution tasks senators to answer is whether the president committed an act so extreme and egregious that it rises to the level of a high crime and misdemeanor. Yes, he did. The president asked a foreign government to investigate his political rival. The president withheld vital military funds from that government to press it to do so. The president delayed funds for an American ally at war with Russian invaders. The president's purpose was personal and political. Accordingly, the president is guilty of an appalling abuse of public trust.
The final vote on abuse of power was therefore 52-48 and obstruction of Congress 53-47, and with the exception of Romney, was along party lines and fell exceptionally short of the required 2/3 majority.
53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment.
In order to fully understand the possible political ramifications of Trump's impeachment, it's necessary to look at the other cases of impeachment that have happened historically. As we pointed out in our last video on impeachment, there have been 3 presidents thus far to be impeached. Andrew Johnson in 1868, Bill Clinton in 1998, and now Donald Trump in 2019. And while not formally impeached, there were proceedings against Richard Nixon in 1974, but he resigned before they could conclude. So let's take a look at these individually. In the aftermath of the US Civil War and the assassination of President Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. As Southern congressional delegations were not present in Congress, radical Republicans who controlled Congress engineered the Tenure of Office Act, which required Senate approval for the president to dismiss any members of his cabinet. I say engineered because Republicans in Congress knew Johnson would probably violate the act, given the disagreement over the policies of Reconstruction. Essentially, they just wanted to try and get rid of the president. Despite the act, Johnson fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. As a result, the House of Representatives impeached Johnson on 11 counts. After the trial in the Senate, Johnson was acquitted with a vote of 35 to 16, a margin of only one vote needed for conviction and removal. The impeachment effectively ended any influence Johnson had as president, and while he sought the Democratic nomination for the 1868 presidential election, he failed to obtain it, though he would go on to serve in the Senate for the state of Tennessee. While not officially impeached, Richard Nixon had articles of impeachment passed by the House Judiciary Committee. Nixon's case originated with the Watergate scandal that involved people working in the committee to re-elect the president bugging the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The night the bugging was supposed to take place, a security guard noticed the door taped to remain open. The burglars were then arrested, and subsequently, the White House engaged in a massive cover-up in an attempt to hide any connection between the break-in and the White House. Eventually, the House of Representatives authorized an official impeachment inquiry by a vote of 410 to 4. While Nixon resigned before he could be impeached, the first president to do so, most people believe that he would likely have been removed from office if the trial had been allowed to proceed. In the case of Bill Clinton, his impeachment began with the appointment of Ken Starr, the independent counsel that investigated the WHITEWATER controversy that surrounded real estate investments by the Clintons in the 1970s. The investigation led to the uncovering of his affair with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. Subsequently, Clinton falsely told a grand jury that he did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky. Clinton was eventually impeached on the counts of perjury and obstruction of justice. Like President Trump's impeachment, the vote on Clinton's articles of impeachment were almost entirely along party lines. The impeachment trial proceeded to the US Senate, with then Chief Justice of the United States, William Rehnquist. Also like Trump, Clinton was acquitted on both articles and retained his office. So now let's take a look at the political implications of the impeachment. Obviously, the only trial of impeachment in modern times to look to for precedents is Bill Clinton. After that trial, the Republicans suffered in the 2000 elections, with net losses in both houses of Congress, and while they won the presidency, it was one of the closest presidential elections in US history. However, to be fair, Clinton's affair was seen by some as a personal issue, and not an abuse of presidential power, and therefore not grounds for impeachment. What makes Trump's situation unique is that he's the first president to be impeached, and then go on to run for re-election. In both Clinton's and Nixon's case, they were term limited by the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, that limits a president to 2 4-year terms. And because there's no precedent, it's unclear how impeachment will affect Trump's re-election campaign. It's worth noting that both the Clinton and Trump impeachment were widely unpopular with about half of the American population. So, if the political backlash this time is similar, it could spell trouble for the Democrats heading into 2020. As congressional elections take place at the same time as the presidential election, Democrats also stand the chance of losing control of the House of Representatives, and any possibility of gaining control of the Senate. But again, to be fair, Clinton had a much higher approval rating than Trump does now, so that could certainly have played into why the Democrats still performed well after his impeachment in the 2000 election. However, it's worth stating that both presidents have experienced higher approval after their impeachment than they did before. We also have to keep in mind that this time around the internet is far more widely used, which means that information is more readily available than it was 22 years ago. Obviously, it's impossible to tell what's going to happen. There's a lot of time between now and the election in November. We will of course keep you up to date with everything that happens during this election cycle. So if you want to see more of our videos, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified whenever we post a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make all the videos on this channel possible.